First of all, I just want to say welcome to all of you. I'm glad to see a group like this on an agricultural experiment station. You're on an ag research farm right now. And I had no idea what I was stepping into when I came to yesterday's meeting. I knew I was going to talk agrivoltaics, of which I am not an expert. But when I came to this group, it's been a real pleasure getting to know a lot of you and getting some new perspective, because perspective drives a lot, right? I'm standing before you now in my cowboy hat, but whether you've got it on visibly or not, each of you wears a hat, right? And that perspective underneath that hat helps drive what you'd like to see consumers adopt, society promote, a whole host of things. So as I stand before you now, don't make any mistake. I'm not a farmer. I am an academic. I am in the university. I am director over the Central Missouri Research, Extension, and Education Center, which is essentially the research farms in the central part of Missouri that I oversee those. And so we promote and support the university missions of research, education, and outreach, delivery to the consumers, to our public, right? And so let's jump into a little bit of what I want to talk about today. We'll see if this works. And this is just a quick outline. So I walked into this, again, not knowing the group I was going to be talking to, really. This is my first time, and I hope it won't be my last time in front of you all. But we're going to cover a lot of different topics here because I like to make a case of why something should work. And so I said I'm not an agrivoltaics expert, but I think I'm going to present tools today which can help you and help producers, more importantly, the adopters, right, who might be implementing technologies on their farms, be successful. So, does solar make sense on agricultural lands? I just asked that question, and of course, I'm going to give you what the AI answer said up there. It said, sure, it does. Essentially, there's a lot of, but it revolves on numerous benefits: renewability, environmental friendliness, and cost effectiveness. And if you look on down there through what the AI interpretation was, it said, yes, solar panels can make sense on ag land, and in many situations, through the combination of energy production and agricultural activities, agrivoltaics. So right away, they lump those two together in there. But before we're too quick just to jump on and say everybody should be doing it, we got to ask a few more questions. I'm glad the text came up to where you all can read it too. I asked further, I said, does solar make sense on agricultural lands? And an interesting article came up. It's titled, Does Solar Have a Dark Side? Solar Impacts on Rural Landscapes and the Family Farm. And, you know, I think it's incumbent upon each of you out here, and me too, to know your consumer and understand their perspectives. If we can't even appreciate or respect their perspectives, we're going to fall short on the sales job here. And some of that perspective is driven by culture. Although it had been over a decade since my hunting boots touched the ground in Surrey County soil, it felt like going home. So many of my core memories have that county's soggy river bottoms, lush farmlands, and thick hardwood forest as their backdrops. And further, some more additional quotes from within there. To me, solar power is nothing more than another form of speculation eating up land right and left. It's just another threat to our way of life, which is already as stressful as it can be. And so when talking agrivoltaics and putting it onto landscapes, are we talking agrivoltaics, or are we talking like the picture up here might have, a solar farm, where you put solar panels out and you put a fence up with barbed wire around the top of it to boot? Are we merging with the farm culture? Many farms in multi-generational, right? I heard George talking about his farm, and I've enjoyed some of the sidebar conversations, even though I knew George from the university environment. We've never really talked solar and agrivoltaics and his family's farm, but you're talking to folks that come from many generations of farming on land. Um, and you're asking them to change. Are you asking them to change and not be a farmer? Well, that's going to be a tough sell. So agrivoltaics is a way, I think, to come at this, but it too has to be done with some respect for their perspective on things and recognizing that in our design. Additionally, does solar make sense on agricultural lands? I'm never a big, I don't like to tout the numbers of saying what's going to happen by 2050. Just too many things can happen in between now and then. But let's just recognize the world's population is going to grow. And it's not just energy that we've got to supply, but it also is food. And it's the demand for type, quality, and source of food that has to be recognized. So all the food that we have, all the food we eat, all the food we enjoy has got to come from agricultural lands. And so if we're superimposing on those same ag lands, that they have to provide the power to feed power to all the world, we've got to come to some grips with the challenges that maybe not everything can be done on ag lands, or discover solutions so we can merge the perspectives and the needs of society, including food production. And so I ask Google another question: is agrivoltaics a sustainable solution? And their short answer was yes. And I think I'm going to stay with yes, but I'm going to highlight a word that was used on further down in that definition, or when I asked that question, and that is it highlighted the synergistic relationship. And I think that's what we're after. That's something where all of us benefit, right? And we work together on that solution. And so as we move forward, I'm going to highlight from agroforestry, which I worked for about 11 years promoting trees back into farm landscapes. That's agroforestry. I'm going to put into this talk the lessons learned from agroforestry, how they might apply to agrivoltaics. And in case you're curious, the basic agroforestry practices include riparian buffers, also windbreaks, which were a big deal around the Dust Bowl period. We seem to have forgotten some of those conservation benefits today as we remove those windrows. Forest farming, silvopasture, and alley cropping. Suffice to say, it's integrating trees with farming for conservation and production. So we're conserving resources and meeting production needs. That should sound a lot familiar to you with what we're shooting for in agrivoltaics. So what have we learned if we try to compare those two? Well, you are on an ag research farm right now, and power generation and agrivoltaics is important to us, but you don't see trees on this cropland around here, do you? My guys already complained that we're trying to do farm scale relevant studies on postage stamp size trials, right? So we farm 1 to 5 acres, and then we tell producers who farm thousands of acres how that applies on their land. There's some really inherent challenges there, but so scale is a problem here for us but additionally, when I start talking about putting trees out there, you do realize most farmers, whether you're talking pasture or cropland, that either their dad or their great grandpa cleared that land, right? Now, mostly we're talking trees. I get that. But now you're going to say, let's put a solar panel out there. How are we working with them in their farming practices so we don't just talk putting obstacles back on the farm landscape that interfere with their farming? So I think, can we complement farming production? I think we can. Society has a demand for clean energy. And we have demands to feed a growing population. We need to be able to merge those demands in ways that make sense. For me, and for a lot of the remainder of this talk, I'm going to take a look at pasture-based systems as opportunities. And so here's just a few pictures, everything from utilizing solar panels on dairy farms, to some work done at Penn State where there's some sheep grazing between the solar panels. The picture down in the bottom right corner is a photo based in the Netherlands by a company called Solar Gick. And why is pasture-based solar present us with an opportunity? First and foremost, I think it can integrate with livestock production, and we'll highlight some of those benefits as we go. And because in Missouri alone, we have 6.9 million acres of pasture ground. Now, I don't think we're going to put solar on every acre of pasture ground, right? It's not all flat and open ground, but it's workable within grazing systems. And so to do that, we're going to manipulate and manage light or shade and its availability for forage production and how we move our livestock on that same ground. And so we've got to be able to combine those needs, light, forage, and animal husbandry or movement of. And part of my perspective on this was influenced by a gentleman named E.O. Wilson, who wrote a book called Consilience, The Unity of Knowledge. And consilience is just pulling knowledge from diverse sources and combining those knowledges. When you heard John talk about compromise, he said, we're looking for a workable solution. Consilience is the same in that it pulls those knowledge sources and tries to build them together in a successful way. The Venn diagram is one way to express that. And so when I was in my history of sustainability of ag and forestry and agroforestry has always been critical. It's how do you define sustainable? From his book, sustainable is defined as socially acceptable and desirable, environmentally possible and economically feasible. Now, if I had this to do over again, knowing this group here, I'd put another Venn diagram up there too. I would put, say, architects and engineers, design consultants in one circle. I'd put utilities, co-ops, and electric grid service providers in another one. And I'd put farmers or producers, landowners in one. Each having different perspectives, wearing different hats, right? But there is a sweet spot where we can come together. Make no mistake, though, as John highlighted, it's going to be based on compromise. The only way we create something that meets very diverse expectations and outcomes is through a little bit of compromise. And it's going to be challenging because it involves each of us seeing the world from others' perspectives. So let's talk about what I've learned about grazing systems and components of success and how we integrate those. So these all have to work together, right? Cogs in the machine, shade management, forage production, and livestock husbandry. So one of the first questions I want to ask is, do cattle need shade? And I'm focused on cattle here. It could be sheep or other livestock, but I'm focused on cattle because Missouri, as you sit here right now, is, I think, third in the nation as a cow-calf producing state. So we bounce back and forth, second or third in the nation in terms of how many cows and calves we produce as a state here. So do cattle need shade? The correct answer is it depends. Depends on what they're grazing, whether that's endophyte-infected fescue. And endophyte is a fungus that grows symbiotically with the fescue, but then it produces some stress in the animals because of an alkaloid that's produced. Now, it's a tough grass. It grows in a lot of different environments. So we grow it here, and there's ways you can manage around the stress and how that impacts your animals, but shade is one way. So what kind of breed of cattle do you have? Do they need shade or not? What's the overall condition and what are the animals used to? And I'll highlight in here that there is plenty of good quality water present. When we talk about animal needs, water is a big driver there. And so understanding this, before we get into looking at forages and other things, how you situate any type of solar panel field has got to be done with some planning with respect to where water is available. Because as this highlights here, the further you get from your water source, the less they utilize the forage. And if you're a farmer, you're growing grass, or if you're a cattle farmer, you're growing grass because that's what produces your animals, right? Puts weight gain on them. And so you want them eating that grass. If they got to go too far, they don't use the grass. In this, it also depicts the impact on manure distribution. If you look at the far right side of these, that should say a shade over there. So there's shade on the far right axis. And then the bottom is just the distance from water. If you look at that top picture, what you'll see is that as you move further away from water towards there's less utilization or less manure distributed there, and it's more confined around shade on the far right or water on the lower left corner. And so how can we impact that? Well, if you shrink the size of the area that's fenced in, your shade is a little closer to your water, and it's only 400 feet from water source to shade, all of a sudden you get better manure distribution across your pasture. Now, maybe not important to the power production of solar, but if I'm an ag producer of cattle, it minimizes fertility I've got to put out there on my pasture. And so that fertility distribution also saves some money. Again, this is about recognizing perspective and how we can design so that it meets the needs of the producer and also the desires of clean energy. And so is shade good or bad? Well, if it's too far in how you place it on the property, then it could result in manure being centralized underneath that shade. And time spent under shade reduces the amount of time my cattle are grazing as well. I want them out there grazing grass, right? Not just loafing in the shade. So we got to be thinking shade and water placement. These are critical to how those animals perform and their impact on the pasture environment. But it does have real benefits in improved animal condition, improved fertility, breeding efficiency, improved milk production. If you can reduce the stress on your dairy cattle, they're going to produce better milk for you. Better feed intake, better weight gain. It's about reducing stress. And solar panels in the cattle farm can have a real role to play, I believe, in reducing stress on the livestock. So let's talk a little bit about what grass you're growing out there too. Because anybody got yards with trees growing over top them and have trouble getting grass to grow out there? You go to the store and you buy the sun shade mix or the shade mix, and I can still have problems getting it to grow in my yard. All right. So when we were promoting agroforestry, putting trees into pastures, we also want to promote a grass that's going to grow. The same thing in agrivoltaics. And so what we've learned from some artificial shade trials was just what grasses do well about under how much light. And so these bar graphs represent the range in shade tolerance for these grasses based on what the literature and science says. And then that darker green area in the middle is just the average of what the literature and research would promote. Most of your cool season grasses are going to do pretty well under that 50 to 60% shade. And so, however, when you move into some of your native warm season grasses, well, if anybody's into native plants, because they're a big push too, is matching the plants we promote and landscaping and everything else using natives. The native warm season grasses, though, they require much more sunlight. So when you're talking about designing an agrivoltaics setup, be aware of how your grasses are going to perform for that cattle producer. And so shooting for about 50% shade or 50% light is going to be a real nice sweet spot for, at least for most of your cool season pastures. And if you don't know, cool season means putting on most of its growth in the spring or in the fall. Over the summer, it kind of shuts down on its growth. You all know this from your lawn pasture, from your lawns, right? Not lawn pasture, but your lawns. You don't have to mow as much over the summer. Moisture reduces, and the heat goes up, and your pasture or your lawn growth goes down. So, but if we select the right forage, underneath partial shade, it'll also improve in quality. So the digestibility for the animals improves. This is all a win-win for a producer then to have some shade out on their pasture ground. But we don't want to just store animals out there. So utilizing some good grazing principles is essential. And a part of good grazing principles is how long animals are on that grass and when they're moved, in order to capture the benefit between quality and also fiber content for the animal. And the longer it grows and the taller your grass gets, the lower the nutritive value for that animal. However, they'll eat it when it's real short, but there's not a lot of biomass out there for them to eat, right? So there's a sweet spot in there where animals are not on there too long and they're moved on a regular basis. And that allows your forage to regrow and maximize value as well as biomass on a per acre basis for the animal producer. And so there's some good guidelines out there about how you do that. But the other reason that's important, and I put this picture back up, I have no idea what Penn State is doing there in that image. So don't get me wrong, research does things in kind of awkward ways at times that may not make sense, but they produce results that help in the statistics, right? But when I look at that picture with those sheep, that grass is grazed down pretty tight and pretty short. In a study done out of Nebraska, where you have a poor pasture that's been overgrazed, grazed short, after a 3-inch rainfall, they saw a significant increase in soil loss and in runoff. So in today's world, some of the big talk in regenerative agriculture and soil health revolves around water holding capacity in my soil. So we don't want water running off. We don't want it to end up down in the Gulf of America or Mexico, whatever flavor you savor today. Cinco de Mayo's coming, right? So, but we don't want the water running off, carrying nutrients off pasture or off crop ground, and creating algae blooms and other problems. Keep the water local on your site, recharge soil and other things. The best way to do that is to maintain good pasture health. And so when we talk about rotational grazing or moving your animals on a regular basis and not eating the grass down too short, this picture highlights why. You can remove up to 50% of the leaf area or the above ground growth on your grass and have just very minimal loss in rooting structure. But if you overgraze, you start moving up into 70%, 80% removal of the above ground leaf area. What you end up with is on the hard left there, which, yes, you still have grass on the surface, but you have very little root structure underneath the ground. And so your channels for water to permeate and get down deeper into the soil profile, the opportunity for root growth and dieback to occur, and to build that soil up with soil microbes that are desirable, and all of that's diminished if you overgraze. So if you're just putting animals out to control the grass, you can do that, but it's going to have environmental consequences. And it's more of a solar farm than it is beneficial to the producer, because it's setting that grass growth back and causing some challenges there. The better root structure, by the way, also the above ground growth, regrowth of the grass after it's grazed off is going to be better with more root structure. So some keys to Managing and design of successful agrivoltaic grazing systems, from my perspective, is look at appropriate light levels. You'll notice these panels in this picture here have some gaps between them. Remember, compromise. It's probably not maximizing the solar return on a per acre basis, is it? However, because I'm letting some of that solar go down and grow the grass, it's going to help me as a cattle producer. So if you want widespread adoption, if that's a desirable, then I think this is a selling point. Create and design systems with appropriate light, good panel heights so I can operate my farm tractor underneath it too. Sell the concept with appropriate forage selections in there, the right grass on the site, and promote rotational grazing. So not just letting your animals stay in there, but move them around on a regular basis so that you maintain good forage growth. And so planning definitely, I think, leads to success and better insurability of our better ensures sustainability. And from a farm producer, the integrated systems with a little bit of shade also yield better in terms of my animals' productivity. This has got old numbers from years ago, but the integrated system versus traditional. Traditional was just open pasture. In the integrated system, where cattle had some overhead cover, whether it's shade during the summer or overhead cover in the winter, the left column there highlights that body loss. So the amount of condition and weight that those animals lost over the winter was less when they had some tree cover overhead. I think solar panels can do the same thing. That shelter overhead, it also resulted in easier calving. So the mamas didn't have to work as hard to deliver that calf. And ultimately, the calves weaned at a heavier weight. That all puts more money back in the producer's pocket. So agrivoltaics, I think, can be a real win for the farmers if done appropriately. And potentially not every pasture needs to have shade. Ideally, so what? We've got 6.9 million acres of pasture ground in Missouri. Yeah, but some of that's on north facing slopes. Some of that's in areas that just are not going to be really good or accessible. How do you connect up all those acres to the power grid, right? It's not going to function on every acre, but by looking at it and designing it, you can incorporate it so that there is some shade available on pastures and paddocks that'll benefit producers different times of the year. And at the end of it all, when we start looking at what we're doing and trying to do here, it's recognizing, taking advantage of interactions that are already occurring, creating a synergistic balance. That means I, as a farmer, might want to adopt this. It's going to enhance my production. It creates maybe a more stable grid for you all if you have some of these agrivoltaic farms scattered around, putting power back into the grid. But it's always in the balance. There is the potential to enhance farm productivity, but these systems are going to be more complex. They're going to create more, they're going to take a little bit more work to create and maintain. They offer good environmental stewardship, not just in a clean power source, but also the ability, if done correctly, grazed correctly, to capture and hold water on the site. There's economic opportunity through integration. However, farmers can be a tough sell. So some of the things that I learned, I working with Dogwood Solar, when we had the idea to do some agrivoltaics, they were all in on that. But I learned I can't just plug into the electrical grid and they're not just going to pay me for everything I produce. Not necessarily, right? There's offsets versus what I'm trying to pump back into the grid. So, and Boone Electric has been good to work with in some of our design, but there are definitely some challenges. And the producers, your ag farmers that are a tough sell are going to need those answers. So this is what we're proposing to do and looking forward to discovering funding mechanisms for on our beef research and teaching farm. I think it's important to you all because we have hundreds of cattle farmers and a good relationship with the Missouri Cattlemen's Association. And so they all come through looking to us to talk about breed specifics, to talk about AI, which was a livestock term before it was artificial intelligence. It was artificial insemination, right? So we talk AI, we talk breeds of animals, we talk performance and weight gain. Agrivoltaics, I think, has a role to play on the farm, offsetting our electric use. But we're also going to be able to do a great deal of research around those solar panels and then communicate our results so that farmers can envision adoption on their properties. Elevated panels, we're looking at 15 feet off the ground. Quite a bit different, and we're not going to create a solid row of panels. We're going to try to produce that 50% light and be able to operate equipment. I mentioned dogwood solar, Dan Shifley and Frank. My apologies to you, friend, for not putting your name up there too, but Dan, I know because I knew his dad. I still know your dad. His dad, Steve Shifley, was with the USDA Forest Service. And so in my forestry education, I knew Steve quite well. It's been a pleasure to work with Dan because Dan and Frank both brought a willingness to say, we'll look at solar from a different perspective with you. We'll look at how to integrate that into your farm setting in a way that enhances productivity. And so they've worked with the information I've given them to get us some design concepts. It's with an engineering firm right now getting engineered because that's the university way. And then it'll go out for bids. But I wouldn't be where I am today in thinking about agroforestry or agrivoltaics without acknowledging you all and Dogwood Solar. So thank you for your input and continuing my education. So I think we're all after long-term viability as a society with food, with power production. We're looking at how we can increase productivity and enhance utilization of resources without degradation. And how we do that with the ability to support rural culture and economy. These things are all challenges, but they're not insurmountable. And I think agrivoltaic grazing systems definitely has a role to play in doing that.